George Washington. Learn English through historical stories about U.S. presidents. Improve English. The story consists of 3 parts. Part 1, From Farm Boy to Founding Father. Part 2, Forging a Nation. Part 3, Legacy and Reflections. Part 1, From Farm Boy to Founding Father. Chapter 1, Born of the Earth. Long before he became a legend, George Washington was simply a boy of the land, barefoot, quiet, and observant. Born on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia, George entered a world of hard soil and harder expectations. He wasn't born into riches or nobility, but into a planter family navigating the rough tides of colonial life. His father, Augustine Washington, was a respected planter and justice of the peace. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, was fiercely independent, pious, and known for her unyielding strength. When George was just 11, his father passed away. The dreams of a classical English education faded with that loss. What remained was the field, the forge, and a future built not on inheritance, but intention. George learned discipline on the farm. He surveyed land, rode horses, and read what books he could find. He copied out rules of civility and decent behavior, a list of 110 moral maxims by hand, etched into memory and later into manner. These early years shaped not just a man, but a moral compass that would guide a nation. Chapter 2, The Surveyor's Eye. At 16, Washington began his career as a surveyor. While others his age were chasing leisure, George was charting wilderness. He mapped forests and valleys across Virginia's western frontier, learning to read both the land and the people who moved through it. He slept under stars and earned respect from settlers and soldiers alike. But his ambitions didn't end at maps. In 1753, at just 21 years old, Washington was chosen by the colony of Virginia to deliver a message to the French in the Ohio Valley. It was a diplomatic mission into hostile terrain. His courage and the detailed journal he kept caught the attention of British commanders. The next year, the young Virginian found himself on the front lines of a global conflict. Chapter 3, Baptism by Fire. The French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, was Washington's crucible. Though technically a colonial officer, he saw more action than many British generals. He survived ambushes, skirmishes, and deadly retreats. At the Battle of Monongahela, bullets tore through his coat. Horses were shot beneath him. He never flinched. He learned harsh lessons, how arrogance leads to defeat, how fear cripples leadership, and how calm saves lives. Though he never achieved the full rank he hoped for in the British Army, Washington left the war seasoned. He was respected, if not fully recognized. But most importantly, he had seen how imperial command could ignore colonial needs, and how loyalty could be taken for granted. Seeds were planted, seeds that would grow. Chapter 4, A Quiet Life That Wouldn't Last. In 1715, Washington married Martha Custis, a wealthy widow with 2 children. With this union came not just affection, but also Mount Vernon, his beloved plantation along the Potomac River. He hoped for a life of farming, family, and community. He managed his estate with rigor. He raised stepchildren with care. He oversaw construction, crop rotation, and civic duties. His stature in Virginia society rose steadily, and by 1774, he was elected as a delegate to the First Continental Congress. He didn't speak often in the halls of power, but when he did, men listened. Chapter 5, The Drumbeat of Revolution. By the mid-1770s, tensions between the American colonies and Britain had reached a boiling point. Taxation without representation, trade restrictions, and the presence of British troops fanned flames of rebellion. Washington, once a loyal subject of the Crown, grew weary. He wasn't impulsive, he wasn't radical, but he was principled. When the Second Continental Congress met in 1775, Washington arrived wearing his military uniform. His message was quiet but clear. He was ready. When offered command of the Continental Army, he accepted, not with boast, but burden. "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with," he said. "But, as the Congress desires it, I will enter upon the momentous duty." Chapter 6. The Reluctant General. The early days of the Revolutionary War were desperate. Washington commanded farmers, fishermen, and merchants, under-equipped, under-trained, and underfed. Yet he refused to yield. At Boston, he forced a British evacuation. At New York, he endured defeat but kept the army alive. At Trenton, in the dead of winter, he crossed the icy Delaware and struck back, reviving a cause many had written off. Washington lost more battles than he won. But he won the one that mattered, the trust of his troops. He led not from a throne, but from the field. He shared their hunger, he endured their cold, and when given extraordinary powers, he never abused them. He ruled not by fear, but by example. Chapter 7. Holding the Center. Throughout the long years of revolution, Washington's greatest achievement may not have been any single battle, but the fact that he kept the army together. He navigated mutinies, supply shortages, political infighting, and whispers of replacing him. At Valley Forge in 1777-78, his troops suffered brutally from cold, disease, and despair. But Washington held them steady. He brought in Baron von Steuben to drill them. He wrote endlessly to Congress, pleading for aid. He stayed when he could have retreated. His presence was the glue. And when victory finally came in 1781 at Yorktown, it was Washington who accepted the British surrender. Not with triumphalism, but solemn resolve. Chapter 8. Surrendering Power. 1783, with the war won, Washington shocked the world. He resigned his commission. He went home. No man had ever done that. Kings kept power, generals claimed thrones. But Washington, perhaps for the first time in modern history, chose to walk away. Even King George III, when told of Washington's resignation, reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." Washington's act became the cornerstone of the American experiment. Power, he showed, could be entrusted to the people and returned without violence. Chapter 9. The Nation Calls Again. Retirement didn't last. In 1787, Washington was unanimously chosen to preside over the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Though he said little during the debates, his presence gave the proceedings legitimacy. When the Constitution was ratified, the people called again. In 1789, George Washington was elected the first President of the United States, with every electoral vote. No campaign, no ambition, just service. He would build a presidency from scratch. He would define a country still searching for its soul. When the Constitution was ratified, the people called again. In 1789, George Washington was elected the first President of the United States, with every electoral vote. No campaign, no ambition, just service. He would build a presidency from scratch. He would define a country still searching for its soul. Part 2. Forging a Nation. Chapter 1. Building the presidency, on April 30, 1789, George Washington stood on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City, placed his hand on the Bible, and took the oath of office as the first president of the United States. The crowd below roared, bells rang, but Washington himself was not celebrating. "I walk on untrodden ground," he said. "There is scarcely any part of my conduct which may not hereafter be drawn into precedent." He knew the weight of every word, every step, every silence. Washington's task wasn't just to lead a government, it was to define it. The Constitution was a framework, but how to fill it in, how to execute laws, how to interact with Congress, with foreign powers, with the people. Chapter 2. Establishing order. Washington surrounded himself with capable advisers, launching what would become the President's cabinet. Thomas Jefferson became Secretary of State. Alexander Hamilton took on Treasury. Henry Knox managed war, and Edmund Randolph became Attorney General. This group often clashed. Jefferson and Hamilton, in particular, were ideological opposites. First envisioned a nation of independent farmers and limited government. Hamilton wanted strong central authority and industrial growth. Washington balanced them, listened carefully, and chose prudently. Chapter 3. Setting precedents. Every action Washington took became a template. He created the tradition of the inaugural address, set the tone for executive restraint, and voluntarily limited himself to 2 terms, a norm later codified in the 22nd Amendment. He refused royal titles, insisted on being called president, and dressed plainly. He wanted no crown, no pomp, only service. Chapter 4. Hamilton's economic plan. One of Washington's most consequential decisions was supporting Hamilton's ambitious plan to stabilize the young nation's economy. Hamilton proposed assuming state debts, creating a national bank, and encouraging manufacturing. The plan was controversial, especially the federal assumption of state debts. But Washington saw the bigger picture: unity and creditworthiness. He signed the legislation, setting America on a path of financial credibility. Chapter 5. The Whiskey Rebellion. But with taxation came resistance. In 1794, farmers in western Pennsylvania violently protested a tax on distilled spirits, what became known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Washington saw the rebellion as a direct threat to federal authority. In an unprecedented move, he led 13,000 troops into the region, the only sitting president to personally command an army in the field. The show of force worked. The rebellion dissipated without a shot fired. Washington had proven the federal government could and would enforce its laws. Chapter 6. Foreign Affairs and Neutrality. Meanwhile, the French Revolution shook Europe and divided Americans. Jeffersonians supported the French revolutionaries. Federalists recoiled from the chaos. When France and Britain went to war, both sides expected American allegiance. Washington's response: neutrality. In 1793, he issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, arguing that America should steer clear of foreign entanglements. The decision angered many, but protected the fragile republic. In his farewell address, Washington would later warn, "It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world." Chapter 7. Jay's Treaty. Still, Washington had to manage foreign relations. In 1795, he supported John Jay's treaty with Britain, which settled lingering disputes and averted war. Critics howled, accusing Washington of favoring Britain. Effigies of him were burned. But Washington held firm, valuing stability over popularity. The treaty helped keep the young nation out of another costly war, political factions and growing division. Despite his efforts to unite, factions hardened. Jefferson and Madison rallied Democratic Republicans. Hamilton led the Federalists. Newspapers became weapons. Personal attacks grew vicious. Washington, who had hoped for unity, watched with sorrow as partisanship took root. In his second term, these divisions wore on him. He longed for Mount Vernon, for peace. "I'm again fairly in the view of my native woods," he wrote in 1796 as he prepared to retire. The farewell address. September 19th, 1796, Washington published his farewell address. It wasn't just a goodbye. It was a warning, a vision, a legacy. He cautioned against excessive political parties. He urged neutrality in foreign affairs. He praised religion and morality as pillars of liberty. And above all, he reminded Americans that unity was their strength. His words echo beyond the era, shaping presidential conduct for generations. Returned to Mount Vernon, Washington, retired in 1797 to Mount Vernon. There he resumed farming, walked his fields, and welcomed a stream of visitors. Though no longer in office, his influence endured. But history had one more chapter. In 1798, as tensions with France escalated, President John Adams asked Washington to lead a provisional army. Though and in declining health, Washington accepted. He never actively commanded, but his willingness reassured the nation. On December 14, 1799, George Washington passed away at Mount Vernon. His last words, "'Tis well." Mourning swept the country. Cities fell silent. Bells tolled. Congress wore black for a month. Napoleon ordered 10 days of mourning in France. Washington's legacy was not power, but restraint. Not conquest, but construction. Not self-interest, but sacrifice. He had not just fought for a new nation, he had forged it. Part 3, Legacy and Reflections. The man who could have been king and chose to be a citizen. Chapter 1. The Final Journey. On the icy morning of December 14th, 1799, George Washington rose early, as he always did. The winter air had taken a toll on him. He had been out the previous day inspecting his farms despite heavy snowfall. By evening, he struggled to breathe. His doctors arrived, and they bled him multiple times, as was the medical practice of the day. But it was no use. At 7 years old, the father of the nation passed quietly at Mount Vernon. His final words were simple and serene. "'Tis well." The grief was immense. Cities fell silent, church bells tolled, and Congress wore black for a month. Even in France, under Napoleon's order, 10 days of mourning were declared. His death was not just the end of a life, but the final punctuation on the revolutionary chapter of America's birth, Chapter 2, the example of restraint. More than his victories in war, Washington's greatest act may have been letting go of power. In 1783, at the end of the Revolutionary War, he resigned his commission and returned to Mount Vernon. In 1796, he declined a third presidential term. These decisions were nearly unheard of in global history. Kings didn't step down, generals didn't walk away, but Washington did. When told of this, King George III of Britain reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." And he did. His legacy was shaped not by conquest, but by character. He became a model for future leaders who understood that democracy cannot survive without humility. Chapter 3. the father of a nation. Washington didn't just lead the army, he forged a government. He presided over the Constitutional Convention of 1787, bringing credibility and calm to contentious debates. His presidency became the blueprint for the office. He established the cabinet, demonstrated executive restraint, refused titles, and dressed in plain American fabrics, a deliberate rejection of monarchy. He was a leader, not a ruler, a steward, not a sovereign. His decision to limit himself to 2 terms became an unwritten rule for generations, until it was codified in the 22nd Amendment after FDR. Chapter 4, The Farewell Address. Echoes on Washington's farewell address, published in 1796, remains a cornerstone of American political thought. In it, he warned against entangling foreign alliances, against divisive political factions, against the erosion of public virtue and morality. For decades, his words were read aloud in Congress each year. His speech was more than farewell. It was a final sermon, a blueprint for civic strength and national unity. Though America would not always listen, the echo of his wisdom remained. Chapter 5, A Legacy Rooted in the Land. Despite being at the center of world-shaping events, Washington always returned to the soil. He was a planter, a surveyor, a lover of land. Mount Vernon wasn't just a home. It was a symbol of who he was. He believed that the foundation of a strong republic was an independent, land-owning citizenry, grounded in labor, humility, and virtue. His life, lived in both tents and fields, reflected the fusion of rustic discipline and civic vision. Chapter 6, The Myth and the Man. Over the years, Washington became more myth than man. The famous cherry tree story told by Parson Weems is likely fiction, but its endurance reveals the hunger Americans had for a moral hero. But the true Washington was far more compelling. Reserved in emotion, often described as cold, but deeply empathetic in action. A man who wrestled with slavery, owning human beings even as he expressed quiet discomfort with the institution. One who believed profoundly in providence and whose faith shaped his decisions. He was not perfect, but he was profoundly aware of his imperfections. Chapter 7, Immortality by Character. Today, Washington's name is etched into the geography and consciousness of America. The nation's capital bears his name. The Washington Monument rises above the skyline. His face graces the $1 bill and Mount Rushmore. But his most enduring monument isn't made of stone. It is the peaceful transfer of power, the presidency itself, and the idea that no one is above the law. He is not remembered for what he took, but for what he refused to take. Chapter 8, Legacy in the American Conscience. In every moment of national crisis, leaders have invoked George Washington. Lincoln, during the Civil War, leaned on Washington's unity. Roosevelt, during We Too, cited his courage and clarity. Epilogue. The citizen who led a revolution. George Washington never campaigned for office. He never sought fame. He never claimed divine right or lifelong rule. Instead, he fought to free a people, and when they asked him to lead, he said yes, but only for a time. When that time ended, he said no more, and went home. In that act of resignation, in that final breath, he did something few leaders ever achieve. He defined greatness not by what he built, but by what he left behind. A nation capable of standing without him.